Let's prepare the scene for rendering. First, I'll create a null and name it scene. Then I'll select all objects except the camera and character. Then I'll move it to this null. I'll temporarily hide these objects and the camera. If you remember, we currently have two identical character geometries stored in the scene. One is the animation geometry that we got from Mixamo, and the other is deformed by the animation geometry with the surface modifier. And while I was doing other tutorials, I realized that there's a way to get rid of that first geometry and transfer the animation to the second. This step is optional, and it's not a fact that this approach will work for you. That's because it depends on the export and import settings and on the version of Cinema. Let's give it a go. First, we move the weight tag from the animation geometry to the body geometry. We also need to move the skin modifier. Now I'll deform the geometry so we don't need surface anymore. Next, you should remove the animation in the skin attributes of the include field and put the body there. Also, at this step, you can check how the skin deforms the geometry. If the animation has transferred correctly, you can use this method. You can also transfer the delta mush, which will correct the deformations. After that, you can delete the animation object. The main thing is to keep these bones because the animation is recorded on them. The skin modifier deforms geometry based on changing the position of these bones. I'll temporarily change the colors of these materials to make it clear. At this point, I have the leotard slightly overlapping with the body. If you want, you can use normal move and push it back a bit, but I'll also add a thickness to it. For that, let's just copy the body object. I'll call it swimsuit right away. And before that, just in case, save the scene. Now in the body geometry, I'll select only the leotard and delete it. Respectively, in the swimsuit geometry, I'll remove everything except the leotard. To do this, I use the shortcut UI to invert the selection of polygons. We have two separate objects now, and each of them is deformed by its own skin modifier. Next, to add thickness, select the swimsuit and hold Alt and create a cloth surface. Reduce subdivision to 0 and you can adjust the thickness. It might slightly overlap without subdivision. I'll create a subdivision surface on the whole geometry for the test. Then I'll check in all frames that the leotard doesn't overlap with the body. As you can see, the animation slows down because of the subdivision surface. So I'll delete it for convenience. And I'll also rename the cloth object to swimsuit. We don't need selection tag and all of these materials anymore on the swimsuit object, because there will only be one material that will work for it. That's why I'll delete it all. The main thing is to make sure that the sweep and weight tag are preserved. We'll also not use standard materials for rendering on the body object. So I'll delete all of these materials. The main thing is to leave selection tags. We'll need them. Next, click on this icon to go to the render settings. In the output field, I'll adjust the resolution to 1024 by 1024. It's also a good idea to make sure that frame rate is exactly the same as in the project. In this case, it's 30 FPS. I'll temporarily disable save, and in the Redshift tab, we have all the basic settings. You can use these presets. I like to use advanced mode. And usually, the only thing I change is to change irradiance point cloud to brute force in the global illumination tab. This is where I set the 4 beams, and I also disable caustics. Finally, all we need is this threshold slider in the sampling tab. The lower the value, the higher the rendering quality, and accordingly, the rendering time also increases. I'll start by adjusting 1/10 of this value. We don't have a single material or light source in the scene yet. Let's go to the Material Manager and delete all these old materials. Let's go to Create Redshift, Material, and Create Material. Now drag this material onto the scene object and the character object. I prefer to adjust the basic light on one material first. Let's go to the Redshift tab and click Redshift Render View. Press Start IPR, and in this Redshift window, we'll render the scene in real time. I'll drag this window to the left to make it easier to work. If you disable this lock, Redshift will render whatever you have in the viewport. Here you can select the camera and then it'll always render from that camera, no matter what you have going on in the viewport. We currently don't have any light sources in the scene, and that's why Redshift uses the standard sculptural light. Thus, let's create several light sources. To do that, in the Redshift tab, select Lights and create Area Light. The area light is very similar to a real Studio softbox. In this case, it's square, and if you move and rotate it, you'll see how the light changes during rendering. Before adjusting the final light, I like to adjust some basic studio light. Okay, let's set up some light sources, and with some basic lighting ready, it'll be easier for us to set up the materials. I'll put 2 softboxes on the sides first. To do this, I'll put one and then just hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac and copy it. The same rules apply here as in conventional photography. The backlight separates the objects from the background pretty well. Now I'll copy this light source again and make it into the main light source. Notice that the larger the surface area of the light source, the softer the shadows will be. If you want hard shadows, the light source must be very small. Let's see what settings we have. All light sources have intensity. You can also change the color. It's pretty obvious here. Likewise, you can change the shape. In this case, we have a rectangle. I want to change it to a disc. That way we'll have rounded reflections. You can select all of the light sources at once and, for example, adjust their intensities. Right now we have gray material and it looks too white, so I'm going to reduce the intensity a little bit. Double-click on the material and I'll tell you about its settings. You might see a window like this. The Redshift Material Editor has a node structure. Here you see 2 nodes. This is node output. Everything connected to it will be rendered in the viewport. And this is the material itself. Let's look at some settings. At first, you can change the diffuse reflection. It's the same as just the color of the material. You can decrease or increase the strength of the diffuse reflections as well. Here we have reflection or specular reflection. You can reduce them in strength, change the color, and also use roughness to blur them a bit. Actually, you can get almost any kind of material by using these settings. What if you want to make it into a metal, like gold? You need another setting for that, and that is the refractive index. It affects not only refraction, but also reflection. If I set it very close to 1, and start increasing it, you'll see that the reflection is stronger at the edge, and when the surface is frontal to the camera, there is almost no reflection. Look at that glare. The refractive index for most materials is close to 1.5. If I increase that refractive index, then we'll have all the beams reflecting from all sides. Then, when we set it at 100%, then we get a mirror. For a more proper mirror, we need to disable the diffuse as well. Also, if you want to get gold, you can change the color of the reflections and correct the roughness a bit. Now it looks more like gold. When we baked maps in Substance Painter, you might remember that we had base color, roughness, and the metalness map. But here we don't have metalness. And there is a second model for creating materials. Switch to metalness in the Fresnel type. You'll see that you cannot edit the OIR by default in this mode. This is because the refractive index is always set to 100%. Similarly, you can't change the color of the reflections, because they're exactly the same as the color of the diffuse reflection. Let's enable diffuse, and we adjust the strength of the reflections with this slider. If I set it to 100% now, we can see that the reflection is blue, because the color is the same as the diffuse color. This slider no longer works, because its strength is inversely proportional to the metalness value. In fact, we can convert these two models to each other. If I switch to OIR, turn the OIR to 100%, and turn the reflection strength to 0, it's the same as turning metalness to 0. If I want to simulate metalness 100%, I have to set the reflection power to 1 and remove the diffuse. The only thing is that in metalness mode, the reflection color is exactly the same as the diffuse color. And if I want to simulate metalness 0 in OIR mode, it should look like this. In order to do this in OIR mode, I'll remove the reflections and leave only diffuse. Now they look the same. Due to the fact that in metalness mode we cannot control the OIR, we cannot get this kind of plastic with white reflections. For example, like this, because the color of the reflection in metalness mode is exactly the same as the color of diffuse. And in this case, the reflections will be blue. Let's switch to metalness and check. If I increase the metalness a bit, you'll see that the reflection is blue. And in order to get the same plastic in metalness mode, the easiest way to do it is to turn metalness down to 0, and imagine that this glossy layer is like a coat of varnish. We have the Coating tab for this purpose. The settings here are the same as in reflection. That is, we can increase the reflection strength, also change the roughness, and also change the refractive index. Let me temporarily remove coating for now and try to simulate some reference materials. To begin with, let's try it in OIR mode. For example, I have a model like this one, and we try first in OIR to apply this kind of material. We can see that this is metallized blue material, and most likely it'll have 0 diffuse. Now I'll select the color of the reflections, and slightly increase the roughness, as the reflection is obviously blurry. Such metallized objects are distinguished by the fact that their refractive index is very high. So let's zoom in on it. It's already more like that. And also, we can see that it has some kind of lacquered layer, so we can just add coating. The material seems lighter on the reference, and I want to add diffuse. In fact, it's because the room is reflected in it. And in our case, the black background is reflected. The same thing we can do, for example, in metalness mode. In metalness mode, it'll be easier to make such material. Well, first I select the color, set metalness to 100%, and add coating, which is already there. The materials, like this plastic, are much easier to get using the IOR mode. Here I'll set the standard 1.5, disable coating. The reflection color is white, so I made it white. The color diffuse is obviously red, and I'll reduce the roughness a bit. Now we have a material similar to the reference. Before using the maps from Substance Painter, let's create materials for each individual selection tag. For this purpose, I just hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac, and copy these materials and rename them accordingly. I'll also temporarily change their colors to distinguish them in the viewport. We remove this material with character and drop the body first. And we need to find the selection tag where only the body is selected. Now let's select this material and put this selection tag there. Well, now it only applies to the body. Let's do the same with the other materials. I drop the plastic, find the selection tag with the plastic objects, and drop the selection tag into the material. We'll also use cloth material for the leotard. Therefore, let's just drop the cloth material onto the leotard. In this case, we don't have any selection tags, so the selection field has to be empty. We'll let the hair and the eyes remain that way for now. I don't like to use subdivision surface because it slows down the viewport. But we need some way to smooth out the geometry during rendering. If you want, you can use it, but I prefer the alternative. Redshift has its own subdivision surface. To do this, select the object and create a tag Redshift object. In the tag attributes, go to the Geometry tab, enable Override, enabled, and this slider will adjust the number of subdivisions. Let me set it to 2. The geometry looks smooth on the renderer. Redshift automatically subdivides the mesh before rendering, and we have a low polygon geometry in the viewport. This way, I don't have to constantly enable and disable subdivision to work in the scene and render smooth geometry. Before exporting to Substance Painter, we close the mode of Smoothing Sweeps, and in this tag, we have to select the same mode as when exporting. The only problem is that they're called differently. I'll temporarily create a subdivision surface to compare these modes. So there are 3 modes here too. Edge mode corresponds to all edges mode, boundary corresponds to internal edges, and standard mode corresponds to disabled mode. Since I chose boundary mode when I exported, here I have to choose internal edges. Now we can easily copy the same tag to the other objects that we want to subdivide. For example, on a shoe. Let's copy it by holding down Ctrl or Command. I'll also copy it on the fish. I won't copy it on the disco ball because I want the mirrors to be square. If you add subdivision to the speakers, their geometry will break, because we did it with booleans and parametric modeling, but I made the speakers under subdiv, so I'll drop this tag on the speaker. All the other speakers will flatten out, too, because they're instances. And I won't throw subdivision on the water either, because it's made with bool. Let's try making clothing material using maps from Substance Painter. You should have 12 maps in your folder, 4 for each set. And we need these maps named cloth. You can select these 4 maps, drag and drop them into the material editor, let's first find base color and attach it to the material. You have to aim this blue square until this list appears. Select diffuse color, and as you can see, this texture is visible in the viewport. At this point, we can no longer edit the diffuse because it's controlled by this texture. At the same time, we can still adjust the rest of the material settings. Let's now select metalness, and in order to connect metalness, we need to switch the material to metalness mode. You'll find it in the list. It's in the list of reflections. Reflection metalness. In the same way, let's connect roughness. Roughness is also in the list of reflections, roughness. All our maps work now, and if you don't like something, you can either go back to Substance Painter or find some nodes for color correction and adjust the colors right here. You can do that by searching for node color correct, for example. You can pass the node diffuse through it, and you can adjust, for example, gamma, contrast, and so many other things. Then we have to connect the normal map. I'll zoom in slightly to get a better look at the model. To connect the normal map, we need to find bump map in the search. Put it in shader graph and connect normal map to texture input. And then connect bump map to the material, find overall, bump input in the list. It seems to work now, but it's actually working wrong. We should change the color space to raw in the node of the texture itself. In Node Bump Map, you should change input map type to tangent space normal. After that, the normal map should work correctly. You can see it on the wristband. I'll repeat the same process for the plastic material. First, I'll drop in all the plastic maps. I'll change the material mode to metalness, then connect the main maps. And I'll create a bump map for normal. I'll run a normal map through it and connect it to the overall bump input. Then in the node of the normal map, I'll change color space to raw. In addition, I'll set tangent space normal in the bump map. We use a slightly different material to simulate the skin. I created a temporary light source and disabled all the others to demonstrate the skin material. Let's open it up, and if I drop a diffuse map into this material, we'll have skin that looks like plastic. Also, leather has one property that plastic doesn't have. It's subsurface diffusion. There is a separate material for this, called skin. Well, let's find it in the search and drop it into the shader graph. Now I'll attach it to the output. I'll immediately reduce the radius scale to 10, because 100 is too much. You can find 3 different layers in this material. Let me disable everything for now and demonstrate how it works using one layer as an example. You can adjust the color, intensity, and radius in each layer. If I decrease the radius and make it really close to 0, then this color will behave like a normal diffuse. If I increase the radius, then you can see how the rays go through the object and diffuse inside the color this red. We need several layers to make a realistic skin. This is because there are more vessels in the deep layers and the rays will be colored red. They have to travel quite a long distance before they dissipate. Therefore, the radius will also be quite large. The next layer is the fat layer. I can exaggerate this effect and make it yellow. Here, the diffusion will be slightly less than the dispersion of the deeper layers. The topmost layer is the thinnest layer of the skin surface. Its scattering radius will be the smallest and the color will be closer to a kind of gray-blue. If you look at a skin flake through the light, it'll be almost transparent. Due to these 3 layers, we obtain a skin-like effect. And there is a parameter radius scale in the common tab, which is just a number by which the radiuses of all of the layers are multiplied. You can use it to control the overall diffusion effect. If you increase its value, the diffusion effect will be more apparent. If you want to create a hyper-realistic skin, you can draw maps for each individual parameter of a separate layer. For example, the fingers, ears, and nose have more blood vessels. And you can draw a black and white map for the weight parameter for the deeper layers of the skin. That way, fingers, nose, and ears will be lighter. The same can be done for the fat layers. For example, there's more fat in this area and less on the elbows and knees. Also, we can have different colors of fat in different areas of the body. That's how you create realistic skin on big film projects. But in our case, the cartoon character has blue skin and we have only one map. So let's use just 2 layers. I'll use mid and shallow scatter. I made mid a little warmer and shallow a little cooler. I'll make the mid scatter radius slightly bigger and the shallow slightly smaller. I perceive it as purple jelly wrapped in a thin turquoise wrap. Overall, I like the effect I got. Well, I want to use the maps I generated in Substance Painter. First, I'll drop all the body maps at once. Then I'll find base color. We use 2 slightly different colors for different layers. We can match base color to these colors using color correction. I'll do this by typing color correction in the search box. I'll add this node to the shader graph and connect base color to it. And you can temporarily connect color correction directly to the output. After that, you'll see this map in the render window. I want to make this map close in color to the shallow scatter. To do this, I'll just adjust some values in Node Color Correct. I ended up with this. The colors are pretty similar. Now I'll copy color correction again. I'll connect it to the node output to make it visible. And now I'll adjust the color to this one. We have two maps ready, and now we can connect them to the skin material. In these two slots, in other words, we'll connect the first map to shallow scatter color. Let's connect the second one to mid scatter color. Then let's connect the skin material to the output and see what it looks like. And now the overall scatter effect is still there, but now we also have detalization due to the textures. Now I'll simply return the lighting back to what it was. We have the rest of the maps left to connect. We don't really need metalness maps at all for the skin, so I'll delete it. To connect roughness in the skin, we have another tab, Reflections. Here everything is very similar to the reflections in the standard material. The only thing is that we have two layers of reflections. That is, for example, you can make one layer glossier and another layer more matte. But I'll use only one, primary reflection. Now, if you try to connect roughness, you won't find it in the list. But you'll find reflection glossiness, and that's a bit incorrect. Because glossiness is inversely proportional to roughness. I don't know what this was for, but it's pretty simple to perceive. When glossiness is 0, roughness is 1, and vice versa. And that's why we need to invert its value to connect the roughness map. To do this, type invert, search for node color invert, and run the roughness map through it. You should connect glossiness. Now the roughness map works correctly, and it remains to connect the normal map. For this, I'll also create a bump map. I'll skip the normal map through it and connect the bump map to the bump mapping, bump input. Don't forget to change the color space to raw and change the mode in bump map to tangent space normal. Okay, all the maps are connected correctly, and I'll take a closer look at what it looks like. You might not see it very well in the video, but in my case, the topography on the skin surface looks correct. I also wanted to make a separate material for the shorts. Let's just copy this red material and call it pants. Now I want to throw it on the shorts. In order to do that, I'll need to select the body and select the polygons of the shorts. For this, I'll select these edge loops and using fill selection, select these polygons of the shorts. Actually, I can apply this material directly to the selected polygons. Cinema will automatically create the selection set and the material. You can rename it if you want. But since the name has changed, we need to drop this selection set into the material again. Let's adjust the material of the shorts. I'll delete the standard material and write car paint in the search box. I'll connect it to output. There are a lot of different settings in the car paint material. First, I'll edit the diffuse color and increase it to the maximum. There are two layers of reflections here. You can make one layer more matte, and the second layer here glossier. The most important effect I want is metallic flakes. Right now it's not very visible because the scale is too small. Let's increase the scale, like this. In addition, I'll increase this weight more than 1, for example 30. We can see that this effect is better now. I can also correct the scale. I want to reduce it a bit. Also, you can increase the density, add a little more variation. I'll remove this distance decay, so that they can be seen at any distance. In these settings, you can adjust glossiness and other settings. This effect isn't very visible from this distance, but it'll be noticeable during the animation. Next, let's make the materials for the eyes. So I'll just copy this red material again and name it eyeballs. I'll drop it on the left and right eye and adjust it. I'll simply make a white diffuse. And now I'll copy it again and make it into pupil material. If I want to assign it to the pupils, I also need to select the pupil polygons and put this material on those polygons. Selection sets should automatically appear on the eye geometry. And now we can correct the material of the pupils. I just made it black. Then I'll copy the iris material again for the mouth and put it on the mouth. This time we can use the skin material too. I'll adjust it similar to the skin material, using only 2 layers. In this case, deep scatter and mid scatter. I'll adjust the colors to make it look like this pink bubblegum. I slightly increase the primary reflection value and tweak glossiness. I'll rename the material to mouth, and we can use it temporarily for hair. You can apply materials to the bird in exactly the same way. Since it's part of the body object, we already have a lot of selection sets, and it's more handy for me to separate this bird from the body. If you want, you don't have to do that and just put materials on it. If we want to separate the bird from the body, we'll first copy the body and remove all the skin and delta mush modifiers from it. Also, I don't need those selection sets and weight tag anymore. Basically, we should have only the UV tag and the Phong tag left. I'll rename this object to bird. Thus, we need to remove all geometry except for the bird in this object. Let's highlight the bird, invert the selection, and remove all other polygons. We need to remove the bird's geometry from the body object. For this purpose, I'll select the body object and remove the polygons of the bird. It remains to attach the bird to the head bone. Currently, we have everything attached to the animation, and before we tie the bird to the head, we need to return the character to T-pose. Therefore, we should click Reset Bind Pose in the Weight tag. And now let's drag the bird to the head object. Since the head object is attached to the head bone, the bird will move with it. Now it'll be handy for me to create selection sets and materials on the bird object. This is where I speed up the video. I'll create the materials for this bird. These are standard materials with different diffuse. For example, this one is material for the body, and after I'll make a yellow material for the beak. And after that, I'll highlight the beak polygons and put yellow material on them. Then I use the existing iris material for the pupil. For the boot, I created a standard material and just changed it to diffuse. We have these stars on the material in the reference. I created a black and white map like this in Illustrator. I'm using this map to mix 2 different materials. I'll first drop it into Shader Graph and attach it to output first. We didn't do a UV sweep for the shoe, and since it's always rotated one side towards the camera, we can use flat projection. Select the material that is put on this shoe and change projection to flat in the tag's settings. Now switch to texture mode, and we can move the projection plane of this material directly in the viewport. I'll just adjust its positions and scale it. And I'll go back to the material settings. I want to make two different materials, for the background and for the stars. I already have a material for the background. Let's copy it and make a gold material for the stars. I want to use this mask to mix the two materials. So to do that, search for a node called Material Blender. I connect the first material to base material, base color, and the second material I'll connect to layer 1, layer color. Let's connect it to output right away. And the only thing left is to connect this mask. It has to be connected to layer 1, blend color. Thus, you can create several layers and mix several different materials using masks. Later on, you can customize these materials independently of each other. I want to make a glass sole, and for that I created another standard material and called it glass. I put it on the sole. If you want to make glass out of it, all you have to do is increase in this refraction transmission parameter. And you immediately get glass. The refractive forces are affected by this refractive index. If you set it to 1, the glass will look completely transparent, because the rays pass through and aren't refracted. And when you start to increase the refractive index, they'll start to refract slightly. In Redshift, the refractive index is specified in physically correct values. You can find refractive indexes for different materials on the internet. For glass, the refractive index is close to 1.5. To make water, I use the same material. Just copy it and rename it water. Next, I just put it on top of the water. This is already more or less like water, but first we have the refractive index of water closer to 1.33. But in our case, it's not very important, because we have a cartoon stylization and you can experiment with the value of refraction to make the refractions look nice. The water is illuminated in our reference, which isn't very realistic, but we can simulate this effect. You can do this by finding the Subsurface tab. Here there are settings similar to subsurface scattering. For example, if you increase this scale, this effect will be very similar to what we did with the skin. We also have different modes. If you switch to extinction mode, the rays that will be scattered inside won't fade, and there will be a glow effect. Here we can simply choose the color we like and adjust the radius of scattering. If you want, you can add that glow to the glass material as well. I'll take these same two materials and use them for the champagne glass. Thus, I use glass material for the glass and water material for the drink. Then I'll speed up the video and sketch the materials for the rest of the objects. First, I'll rename this material to background and correct its color. Then I'll copy it several times. First, I'll make a speaker material out of it, and I'll also make a material for the speakers. There's nothing complicated here. It's just standard materials with different diffuse and different roughness. Then for the disco ball, I'll copy the material, put it on the disco ball, and in metalness mode, I'll just make a metallic, mirror-like material. It often happens when you have completely finished a scene and animation, you want to add some details to the character. For example, in this case, I want to add chest hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, and this cross. I want to show you how to add such details already on the animated geometry. I've already modeled these objects. I won't show you how I modeled them. They're very simple and they're simply the boxes. I made the hair with splines and the sweep generator. I divided these objects immediately into two nulls. The face details are those objects that we can just bind to the head bone. Right now they aren't attached yet and hang out in the center. It's very easy to attach them. You've already done it. Just select the weight tag of the body object, press Reset Bind Pose to reset to T-pose, and all you have to do is just drop all these objects into the null head, because that null is already bound to the head, and that's how you can, for example, bind hat glasses and other things. But you cannot do that with details like this hair. That's because this hair has to be deformed by the body surface itself, because the body deforms too. The easiest way is to put all such objects into one null. It's necessary to create modifier surface in this null. It has to be above all these objects in the hierarchy. Let's reset the pose by clicking Reset Bind Pose. After that, select the body as surface in the surface modifier and click Initialize. Now everything should work. You can use the surface to attach not only small parts to the surface, but in some cases it'll even work with clothes. For example, you can change its t-shirt. I don't really like plastic hair like that. I want to make curls. Cinema doesn't have very user-friendly tools for working with hair. But anyway, I'll tell you a short tutorial on how to make them in Cinema. First, let's select the hair object and then click Add Hair in the Simulate menu. First of all, I say that this will slow down greatly. We see that the length of hair is quite long, so in the Guides field, let's reduce the length. For example, to 4. That already looks pretty good. If I make the length too short, I'll already have the geometry they grow out of shining through. That's why I bring back 4. I'll temporarily disable the renderer for now, because it's really lagging. Okay, we can move the surface inward a little bit to compensate for the length of this hair. To do this, let's select the hair geometry, hold Shift and create a displacer modifier. It should become a child object. For the shading field, let's choose white color. Then we can change the offset by means of strength. Let's make it -100 and compensate for the length of the hair. In this case, we have a hair length of 4. We'll put 4 as well. And then the final shape of the hair, it'll repeat the shape of the original geometry. Let's see how it looks in the rendering. It's already better. In order to add any effects on this hair, oddly enough, we have to do it in this material. You should see that you have a new hair matte material. In the Basic tab, you can connect or disconnect the different hair shape modifiers. Well, let's try to include the curl modifier, for example. They update very slowly in the renderer, so let's try to work in the viewport after all. At the moment, the hair isn't visible in the viewport, and to include it in the viewport, go to the Editor tab and enable their hair lines here. In this mode, we don't see all the hair, but only some of them. And so we can understand at least approximately how the hair will look like in this place. Now we can select the material and let's adjust this modifier. Here we should have a curl tab. There aren't many parameters here. We can edit the strength of the rounding, and we can also change the direction to random. This way they'll round in different directions. So now, since they're squeezed, I want to give the volume back. Therefore, anyway, in Displacer, I'll make it, for example, 2 centimeters. Okay, let's see what it looks like. Right now, we have some sticky hair, and I don't like it very much. Well, we can fix that if we add another modifier called Tighten. It just flattens out all those hairs a little. I'll increase its value a bit so that it flattens them even more. I'll adjust both of these modifiers, curl and tighten to get the effect I want. Let's see how it looks on the renderer. Generally, not bad. And I want to reduce the thickness. This is also editable in this material in the Thickness tab. Here you can edit the tips and roots of the hair separately. I'll reduce the radius of the ends to 0, and I'll try to make the thickness of the roots to 0.4 at first. It already looks better. Let's reduce it a little more. So this looks a lot more like our curls. Now let's adjust the material a bit. At this point we're using this material. If we change the colors in it, for some reason it'll slow down the rendering too much. And so I use the Redshift material. In order to do this, I'll create the standard Redshift material. I'll call it hair. And then I'll delete the standard material in it and search for hair. I'll connect it to output and drop this new material on the hair generator. There are not a lot of settings here. The internal reflection color is about the same as the color of metal objects. And the transmission color is what the hair will look like through the light. I'll make these colors pink, turn weight to maximum, and reduce glossiness to 0. Because I want very soft matte reflections, I want to get something between curls and cotton candy. You can also correct the primary reflection. This is somewhat similar to coding in the standard material. I ended up with something like that. Well, the hair looks too thick, but from a distance it looks pretty good. So I set it this way. Also, in the hair generator, we'll disable the dynamics. It's a very heavy load on the processor, and from this angle, it'll be almost impossible to see it anyway. And let's also make sure that the hair is attached to the object and everything works. Finally, let's add a bit of atmosphere. We have these rays on the background in the reference. Also in Redshift, since this is a physically correct renderer, in order to make such a volumetric light, we need to add fog. Well, to do this, let's go to the Redshift tab, Objects, and create a Redshift environment. If you have everything white, let's highlight all the light sources and turn volume down to 0 in contribution. I want to rename all these light sources at once, so as not to get confused with them. I'll also put the hair in character so that it doesn't get in the way. Now let's copy this light source. I'll put it this way. We need to increase its contribution volume in order to add fog. Now it's shining in all directions, and you can see how it scatters in the fog. We can change the spread in the shape parameter. This is the power of the scattering of the ray. Let's reduce its size a little and place it behind the columns. Okay, now I'll decrease its intensity just a bit more. I'll slightly adjust the spread, and also decrease the scale. You can change the color of the fog in the environment settings. I'll make it reddish, like this. And now you can animate this light source, for example. Then you can make an animation like this. Also, I'll copy it on the left side. I want to add another light source above the discus ball. I'll increase its radius and increase the spread parameter. This will simply add an atmosphere. If I increase the intensity a bit, you'll see the objects in the distance fade a bit into the fog. I've already animated these objects. This is the simplest animation. They literally rotate on one axis. And I also looped this animation. In addition, I put them in a separate nulls, so that you can move them, and the animation was relative to this null. I disabled the hair for now so that it doesn't slow down. All in all, I'm content with the scene, but you can experiment with the lighting. Like, you can add volume from this light source. For example, you can make it more directional from above and add some volume to the attribution. I'll just reduce the intensity a bit. However, you can also animate its rotation, as we did for the light sources in the background. Moreover, you can adjust the colors of these light sources. For example, you can make one light source bluer and another one green. But it's up to your taste. You can experiment, and when you're pleased enough, you can start rendering. Before rendering, don't forget to turn on all the objects that you've disabled. For example, I'll enable the hair. Before that, we're rendering in IPR mode. This mode is especially needed for the preview. To see the rendering in the final quality, click this bucket rendering icon. Most likely, the image will take much longer to render, and you'll see how the picture will look in the final quality. Currently, the rendering is a little noisy, and I just need to decrease that threshold value in the rendering settings, in sampling. It's better to reduce it step by step, because the rendering time increases a lot. I think it's too noisy anyway. I'll reduce it to 200s. I think it'll be enough. Basically, I like this level of noise. By the way, if you want to add this bloom, here are some simple color correction settings. There are a lot of different effects, including bloom. It simply adds that kind of glow. I just want to add a little old school 80s vibe. Well, I guess you're satisfied now, so we can render it all out. Let's make sure once again that the resolution is exactly what we need. Frame rate corresponds to the frame rates in the project, namely in our case 30. Now enable save and select the folder in which we want to save our render. Come up with a certain name. I choose the JPG format, and you should also remember to put all frames in output. Or manually set from 0 to 90. But in our case, we need to do from 0 to 89, because as we want to do loop, we have 0 and the 90th frame exactly the same. Thus, I'll cut off the 90th one. After that, click here, Render to Picture Viewer. The rendering can take a very long time, depending on the power of your computer. Here I've accelerated the video by a factor of 10. And when you've rendered the first few frames, just in case, check that they start to appear in the folder you selected. When you've rendered everything, you can open After Effects, import your file. The main thing is to make sure that you have a sequence. Click Import, drop in this window and check how the animation works. If you want, you can apply color correction. For example, I'll apply selective color and make the red shades a little more pink. Besides, you can add some curves to increase the contrast a bit. After that, open Media Encoder and drop this song into it. Select the format you want to save it in, and select a folder. Click Render, and I have this final animation. You can post it to Instagram, and don't forget to tag Motion Design School.